Okay, so as I said, welcome everyone to this workshop, which this evening is focused on biodiversity. I'd really like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet this evening, albeit virtually, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank Alicia from the town of Victoria Park for setting up all of the workshop series, this being the fourth and last one. And I'd also like to thank Professor Kingsley Dixon from University for presenting to us tonight. Kingsley is a very, very accomplished professor, and we are extremely lucky to have him here tonight. So essentially, as Foundation Director of originally science at Kings Park and Botanic Garden for 32 years. Kingsley essentially established conservation and restoration programs that really emphasise the idea of science into practice, funded by 44 industry partners and representing some $24 million worth of research funding in the past decade or so. He's also since established new science partnerships, creating the International Network for Seed-Based Restoration, and is relatively recently the chair of the International Society for Ecological Restoration. And on a personal note, I've had the opportunity to work directly with Kingsley. We've been working on looking at future restoration of the Kent Street sandpit within the town of Vic Park. So that's been awesome, and I really look forward to the exciting opportunity that brings us. As I mentioned, the second session is concerned with biodiversity and really explores a few questions. So firstly, what is biodiversity? Why is it important? And what can each of us do to promote biodiversity within the town? Now, locally, under the town's urban forest strategy, we're essentially aiming to increase our canopy cover from 10% when we first put the urban forest strategy together, up to 20%. And in doing so, also increase the diversity of the town's urban forest generally. Now, biodiversity in urban forests underlies many ecosystem services that are essential to human well-being, as you're probably aware. And interactions with biodiversity in green spaces can also promote a sense of belonging and place, with direct implications for stress alleviation and mental well-being. Now, for all of us to enjoy locally enhanced biodiversity, we of course need to work together. And in recognition of this, the town has numerous programs to encourage that enhanced biodiversity, such as we have an Urban Forest at Home program, which essentially allows our community to take advantage of free trees and shrubs so that you can plant them within your own gardens and verges. We have dedicated community planting days, and we also have events like this. So under the WA Tree Festival, inclusive of the Urban Greening Workshop series. On that note, I'd really like to welcome Kingsley to the virtual floor. If you do have any questions, please feel free to place them in the chat box or raise your hand after Kingsley's presentation. So thank you very much again, everyone, for being part of the workshop, and thank you very much, Kingsley. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Brendan, and welcome to everyone. I have enjoyed my interactions with the town and congratulate you on having a great environmental team that's going to go from strength to strength. And we want to duplicate that excellence across all local government areas of the Swan Coastal Plain, because as you will see, we desperately and urgently need it. I'm going to share my screen now. Whoops, sorry. Share. So can you see that, Brendan?
Sorry, Kingsley. Yes, there it is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so we'll go back. So I want to present on the fact that we live in a biodiversity hotspot. We sort of say this phrase very easily, but in the southwest alone, 8,600 flowering plants call this place home, that we also call home. 12,500 plants for the whole of Western Australia. There's 1,500 species in all of the British Isles. So it shows that we're a place of extraordinary richness. But being a biodiversity hotspot also means that we've lost so much. And at present, we have about 10.8% of the southwest remaining uncleared and capable of being conserved. So in 200 years, in 2029, we will, whether it's a celebration or commiseration, it's 200 years since Europeans arrived here and essentially altered 65 million years of evolution and 65,000 years of careful custodialship by the First Nations people. And I just want to share with you something which we'll come to with the last slide tonight, because I think it really frames some of what we have to do. It's about the way that we keep misreading what these landscapes are and the extraordinary sensitivity of the landscapes to what we do as Europeans. If you looked south tonight, and this is taken by a friend just flying into Perth Airport at 5:30 tonight, you would have seen this. You would have seen a very large brown plume. It's still there. And north of Perth, another brown plume. That's 160 square kilometres of biodiverse, the only jarrah forest on Earth, being incinerated within a 3-hour period using aerial incendiaries. This is a major concern under the new heightened prescribed burning program in our last wilderness areas. And it's something that we need to consider carefully, because the losses of biodiversity, which are soon to be announced by a big study done by Humane Society International, are substantial, including our ecological work that shows these ecosystems have never had fires in autumn, winter and spring in their evolutionary history. We'll come to that at the end of the talk. Now, this is part and the beginning of our story. This is 250 million years ago, and this is Gondwana. All the continents all joined together. You can see they fit very neatly. And if we start the clock going, the continent starts moving apart. And you can see they stay together. And there's a really important date coming up, which is going to be at about the 135 million year mark. And that's an important date because, we'll stop it there, Australia and the southern continents are still connected, but in fact, they're disconnected from the rest of the continental land masses. That's an important date because at that point we had the earliest evidence of flowering plants. The date looks like it could be as much as 170 million years, so some of those nascent early flowering plants went there. But Australia was certainly connected to a block of countries that were really getting into the business of diversifying. And from 140 million years, 135 million years to the present, flowering plants exploded onto the centre stage. Australia did something that no other continent did, and you'll see this here. It broke away. Now, India broke away, went through the equatorial belts, which essentially extinguished much of that original Gondwanan partnership that it had. But Australia drifted north in splendid isolation. South America and Africa collided back with their old Pangean partners, and a whole lot of transmigrated animals and plants came down. So they began the dilution, even though they have large numbers of endemic species. Antarctica, until 5 million years ago, had plants on it, but it froze over. And as a result, that great connection continent became bereft of any of the flowering plants. But Australia was the only continent that became an island continent. And because of that, it developed a flora and a fauna in splendid isolation. It was essentially a Galapagos island, as Darwin would have seen, on an enormous scale. But several other things also happened on this continent. Unlike the Northern Hemisphere, which even up to 16,000 years ago, over 3/4 of Europe was covered in deep ice sheets, as much of North America was, and glaciation occurred. Glaciation didn't happen in Western Australia in the last 250 million years. So essentially, we've had animals and plants not having to contend with kilometre-thick ice sheets, which of course obliterate everything, but they just had to contend with wetting and drying climates. And those mesic and arid interzone periods were what we believe were major speciation events. The second thing was that the climate had extraordinary stability. And I want to show that here. This is the South Pole, the North Pole, but it's not in the North Pole. In the distance is Karenjini National Park, and of course the BHP and Rio Tinto mines. But this is a pile of chert, and in those cherts you can find evidence of some of the earliest life on Earth, and that's a fossil stromatolite that you can see over here. They're the living stromatolites in Hamelin Pool today up at Shark Bay. And what stromatolites are, they are a thin film of cyanobacteria that lay down calcite material and essentially make rock. And that rock grows up, and that's what the ones in Shark Bay are. But in that calcite material in the cherts and in the stromatolites fossilized right next door, we can find some evidence of those first filamentous algae. But the exciting thing is these date at 3.5 billion years. So we've got rocks sitting in places where they've come out of ancestral oceans and been exposed, but they haven't been ground up by glaciers or lost under volcanism or dropped under the ocean. And so we see the second major ingredient in this diversification, which is enormous stability. And the Southwest has had that same sort of stability. That's us here, the Southwest corner, a hyperdiverse region, only matched by the hyperdiversity that you have in far north Queensland, in the great Gondwanan rainforest relics. But the Southwest was an area that went through a third component of diversification. It became very stable, geologically stable, climatically stable, and the third factor was the soils became highly impoverished. By becoming highly impoverished, it's a little like a coral reef. When a coral reef is starved for nutrients, it doesn't get less diverse, it actually gets more diverse. How do you kill a coral reef? Throw a handful of fertilizer on it. That's what happened in Coral Bay, just by the main settlement, when there was uncontrolled use of septic tanks, and algae grew all over the top and in those high nutrient leachates. And as a result, we lost those inshore coral bommies and some of the other coral things. So you've got to go around where there wasn't that action. Same thing happened in our Banksia woodlands, our jarrah forest, our granite rocks, our heathlands and our shrublands throughout the southwest. The soils became, as the agriculturalists referred to it, as gutless. But those gutless sands drove the diversification. It meant that the three factors of great geological and climatic stability and poor soils drove diversity in the southwest virtually unparalleled. What you see here is one of the sort of 5 to 7 endemic plant families. Britain, UK, Europe has no endemic plant families. USA has a couple of plant families, but we have them everywhere. And there are things, some of them, that you'll be very familiar with. That little starflower that's in Jeterup bushland, right in your backyard, is an extraordinary species sitting in its own family and sitting in its own order, the Dasypogonales. The Albany pitcher plant, marvelled by people since it was discovered, totally unrelated to the tropical pitcher plant, and what we believe is a 60-million-year-old survivor of the once great rainforests that were over much of the southwest area. And the other plants that you see in this image are all plants that have deep time stories. And one of those is the plant that you see over here on the left. It's Kingia. Kingia looks like a grass tree, feels like a grass tree, survives and ecologically is adapted like a grass tree, but is completely unrelated to the xanthorrhoeas that we see everywhere. Kingias, which you will see just on the eastern part of the Swan Coastal Plain. There used to be wonderful Kingias at Perth Airport, all long since destroyed with the developments there, are truly remarkable plants. This is them growing up at one of our research sites. Same species as grows in Perth, as grows down in the southwest, as grows in the Stirling Range. Very widespread, very common species. The Ensendale panel that you see there from 1834, painted from Princess Royal Harbour down at Albany. It's a 1.4 metre long panel. There's a number of them in existence in Perth. Shows those same wonderful kingias with the familiar grass trees, the xanthorrhoeas interspersed, but these majestic plants. Why are these important plants? Because when the DNA work was done on them, they discovered a remarkable thing. Firstly, that they were unrelated to the familiar grass trees, but more importantly, they found that the diversion date, or the break point in the phylogenetic development of this group, was around 120 million years ago. So here we have a plant, when you look at it, and similarly with your little Star of Bethlehem, the blue tinsel lily, but more so with the kingia, you're looking at a plant that has survived and moved across these landscapes very successfully for a period of time unparalleled on every other continent. Nothing has those sort of deep times. How does it do it? Very simply. That big single stem is probably less than 100 years old. It'll eventually get to about 150 years old. And as you can see, the one in the back, it'll fall over. Those little ones that you can see coming up with the people standing amongst them are in fact very slow growing basal shoots, and then they will start to dominate and grow up. So this one plant we suspect is around 1,000 years old from when it germinated, but it's a stable environment. And all these plants have to do, and all the other 600 species that live in this tiny reserve at Mount Benia, just east of Jurien, all have learnt to cope with seasonal aridity and have all learnt to cope with the stringencies of not having a lot of nutrients. Hence, things are diversified, but things are very low. We sometimes refer to these shrublands as coral reef out of water, or I say knee-high rainforest. So extraordinarily rich, diverse, and deep time plants. Now, we can also see some remarkable stories if we look into some of the science that's been done. About 85 million years ago, a very large meteorite hit an area called Eulalie, well north of Perth. It's out near Badgingarra. It made a big sort of 800 metre deep hole, which got filled with dust sediments. And when this was discovered with surveys for oil-bearing materials, they found a disconformity in the geology. That is, they found a round circle and what appeared to be impact ripples coming out from it in the subrock. They then put some drills down and bored out some rock material, and what they found was what you see in the top left. This is work done by John Dodson and his team when he was at UWA in the geography department. And those layers are essentially almost daily, weekly layers of dust slowly deposited. And the segment we're looking at is about the 2.5 to 2.9 million years ago. Now, what they're able to do is essentially those layers can be pulled apart and analysed for the pollen in them. And the pollen, though not alive, still retains its characteristic external information. So you can identify the pollen. And what you see on the image below is essentially that 2.5 to 2.9 million year segment. So it's only 67 to 90 metres. So remember, this is 85 million years ago this happened. So there's a lot more bits of that great impact to tell other stories. But they worked on this bit. And what you see here are all the different plant families, and in some cases a genus and a species, as we've got in Eucalyptus spathulata and Corymbia, the bloodwood group. And what you see are the ebbs and flows of pollen over that sequence of time from 2.5 to 2.9 million years. And as you can see, species came and they went, but they returned when periods changed. And you can relate the periods of change, such as you see here in the Chenopod family, which is the salt lake families. You can see in that period of time, there were some very high arid periods, 3 here, where those salt bushes dominated the pollen deposit. But what's interesting, we found within these deposits evidence that many of the species that we could identify actually still existed at the site today. That's what nearby country looks like. And if we go in there, we can find, here's at least 3 examples of an isopogon, the mat rush which is a thing called Ecdiocolia, not related to Lomandra, but an ancestor of all the cereals, and again, an endemic family to Western Australia. And Stackhausia, amazing plant, which is pollinated by night-flying moths. Many of you will know those. But those three plants, we picked them up in those pollen deposits, and they're still existing at that site. Why is that important? It shows that species don't move around the landscapes very much. And because they don't move around the landscapes, it means the best place to live is home. So the one thing we don't share with Northern Hemisphere plants is an ability for long-range dispersal. And importantly, we have very few wind-pollinated plants in our system because they've learned some other tricks which we're going to learn about in a minute. Now, although we think we know a lot about the Southwest and we've only got 10.8% left uncleared, there are still surprises. This is my little journey in 2018 with 2 orchid species that I discovered just on some remnant plateaus left after bauxite mining just east of Waroona. I thought that they were just colour forms of an orchid we all know and love, which is the yellow cowslip. Grows in Jidderup bushland, a wonderful orchid, very complex to grow from seed, I might say, so being common doesn't mean that you're easy. But these 2 species just look like a white and a pink form, until colleagues in 2018 came and visited, and we went and saw the site, and they said, of course, Kingsley, these are new species. And what they're doing is they're mimicking in the space in the top one, they're mimicking the white cottontail, a distant relative of the kangaroo paw. So that's Conostylus. And Hypercolima, the Swan River myrtle that you see here, robustum, the pink one mimics that. They grow together, but they have different ways of being pollinated, so they stay as separate species. Many thousands of plants growing on this last remnant plateau. So that's just 2018 that we're discovered those as our 2 newest orchid species in the Southwest, to make it around 230 species of orchids that we've got in the Southwest. One of the richest places for ground orchids. So it shows we don't know everything. And on that journey of discovery, I was asked to include this. Of course, we've discovered amazing things about the ecology of our plants. This is a little 50 centimetre by 50 centimetre line in the sand after a big summer bushfire, and in there we've got a vast range of different species growing. There's about 180 different seedlings in a wide variety of families, from stylidiums, trigger plants, to native heaths, to native sedges. In fact, that little 50 by 50 centimetre plot is what we'd call the dream restoration, because many of those species are quite difficult for us. And this is what we're going to be doing at the sandpit site at Jidderup bushland. Very exciting new journey. And what we were able to do with that was work out what actually happened by doing nothing more than putting contact adhesive paper onto those surface grains, taking them off, and then sprinkling them, in this case, with a native species that has an obligate requirement for fire. We were able to discover, in fact, it wasn't the heat or the ash, but in fact the smoke that enabled those species to germinate. And of course, this discovery back in 95 meant that suddenly we could open the book on many species that couldn't be propagated. And we developed a whole range of things, and now smoke water is available. We developed little kits for schools where you had a little vial of smoke that you diluted smoke water that you see here, a little canister of 4 different species that are smoke requiring, and a little punnet of vermiculite to grow them in. And they were a great success. More so mums and dads bought them than the kids, but it was really a lesson about how ecology can inform better opportunities to grow native plants. Now, although we have this remarkable place, there have been remarkable people who have visited us who have been similarly blinded to what we have. One of those visits was by Charles Darwin in 1834 to Albany. This is the journey of the Beagle, the big circumnavigation of the world. He'd come from Melbourne, where he considered a very sophisticated place, and he arrived in a place called Albany, which is a very unsophisticated place of ramshackle mud cottages. It was the middle of summer because that's the only time you could do journeys like this because of winter storms. And he was particularly homesick at this stage. Remember, a lot of time in South America, Patagonia, the Galapagos, discovering all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And then he arrived in Albany. There were lots of flies. It was very hot. It was an unimpressive settlement. And at that point, he said, I do not remember since leaving England having passed a more dull and uninteresting time. And Mr. Darwin got it so very wrong. Had he walked over the hill, Mount Clarence, and gone to Lake Seppings on the other side, he would have discovered these sorts of plants. The bottom one, the world's largest mistletoe, a parasite, Noitsia floribunda, considered the world's most beautiful tree, which has a voracious appetite for lots of different species, particularly loves rose bushes. So if you want to grow one, put it near your friend's rose garden and it'll grow like crazy. But he would have seen these. He was fascinated with parasitic plants. He was fascinated with pollination syndromes, and he would have seen lots of birds pollinating plants, such as the Albany scarlet banksia that you see here. There are no bird-pollinated plants in England, for example, or Europe. He would have also, if he'd looked closely, in some of the little things such as this dasypogon, he would have seen mammal pollination. That's a honey possum pollinating that species. And he would have seen a whole variety of his much beloved carnivorous plants. He would have also discovered things because he was such a great observer that has taken us a very long time to discover ourselves. This is new work just being done by an amateur who is an exceptional citizen scientist, and I encourage you all to take a leaf out of Paul's book, because he's the person who has been investigating these extraordinary rain moths. Now, these are amazing large moths. They're native. They occur in other parts of the world, but different species. We've got several species in the southwest, and he alerted me to these some 3 years ago, and I got very interested because they had associations with particular native shrubs. And you see here a female on the right. She's just hatched from that pupal case that you can see there, arising out of a big load of frass and webbing material, because the little caterpillar, which has lived for up to 6 years inside the stem of this plant, which is a local native species, Myoporum bubiella, that grub sits inside the stem, living on that only on that shrub, and then she waits up to 6 years for one particular large frontal system to come through at the beginning of winter. She emerges, she flies for the night after mating, drops hundreds of thousands of eggs, and then appropriately dies. She's large. She can be up to almost the size of your hand, and a very dramatic moth indeed. So here we see one of the first examples of animals with an utter reliance on our native vegetation. And it starts to show, and this is really recent research for Western Australia, shows the importance of why biodiversity, plants and animals are interacting. Now, the plant doesn't get anything from the moth that we can work it out, but the moth will not exist if we don't have the plant. The good story with this is this very plant is one that we've been using in our Cambridge Coast Care restoration in the town of Cambridge. We didn't know it had this association, but we were really thrilled 3 years ago after Paul Kay came to our area and trained us in how to look for the vestibules, these big frassy areas, that indeed we had been able to bring the coastal jade moth back to our dunes in City Beach. These are the sorts of great things that happen when you protect your biodiversity and care for the native plants. So with Mr. Darwin, yes, he would have loved all of the bird-pollinated plants. 14% of our plants in the southwest use birds variously for pollination, whether it's spinebills or New Holland honeyeaters. Plants have adapted mechanisms, whether they're banksias, grevilleas, native heaths, for depositing their pollen in strategic ways and having effective pollination. So it's a really great system. Of course, nectar is cheap to produce because it just has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They're all available at certain times of the year. And so people or animals can take a reading look.
Probably more to it. The fact we're getting 2 is interesting.
Sorry, I think someone should be muted. Great. And so bird pollination has driven a whole lot of diversification in a vast variety of plants. And of course, the smart people who love their native gardens also pick species that are going to help that local wildlife. And it's not hard to do. And they're wonderful organisms to have. But of course, the honey possums, now very rare throughout Perth, because we've lost so much of our bushland, are truly remarkable. They're the only mammal on Earth which has a complete dependence on nectar and pollen. So it means they need a very great deal of it. And you can see down there, this is work done by Don Bradshaw and his wife Felicity Bradshaw. He's a former professor of zoology at UWA. He's shown that they have an extraordinary amount of sugar intake, about 290 cans equivalent per day for a human. So their high metabolism means they live fast and they die young. In fact, the male doesn't live a full year. He dies just after mating with the female, and the female then goes on to give birth to her young without the competition of the unnecessary males, reproduction having happened. I think there could be a lesson there for all humans. And we just discovered back in Bremer Bay a few years back the first reptile pollination. So this is skink pollination in Banksia lemaniana down at Bremer Bay. Many hundreds of these skinks visiting this plant and apparently being very effective as pollinators. Just to look at Mr. Darwin one last time, had he bothered, he would have also seen one of these most beloved plant groups. These are sundews. Western Australia has 90% of the world's 196 species of sundew. Quite exceptional. We have the world's smallest sundews. They're the pygmies. You can see that one with my fingernail there. And we have about 20 species of various pygmy sundews, and they're exclusive to Western Australia. Or you can go to these real giants, and I call this one the dinner plate sundew. Grows up near Mininu, produces these large bread and butter plate size rosettes of leaves, and you can see a whole variety of hapless insects have fallen into the middle of that. But Charles Darwin, had he seen just some of those carnivorous plants, probably would have stayed a lot longer in Western Australia and probably got to the origin of species, I contend, probably a little faster. Now, we've had research going on various carnivorous plants. This is one of the postdocs in our group, Adam Cross, and we keep finding surprises. And carnivorous plants, of course, get people's interest. This is the only known location for this particular plant. It's called the water wheel plant. It was a plant that fascinated Darwin. It was once found through much of Europe, but because water became contaminated through the Industrial Revolution and industrialized agriculture, this plant needs ultra pure water. So it's gone extinct from many areas. It's extinct in Britain, and it's gone extinct in many of the countries. So although it's the one species, it's widespread and common, or once was common in many parts of the world. Today, it's really an internationally rare species. The last plant died out in Japan and China in the last 15 years. And we were lucky enough to be alerted to the last stand of this species growing down now near Cape Le Grand National Park. It's a wonderful species because you can see those little traps. They're actually first cousins of the Venus flytrap, and they snap shut on little hapless cephalopods and other little crustaceans that live in the water, but it needs ultra pure water to survive. Unfortunately, but fortunately, we'd got there to collect some samples. Unfortunately, they altered some of the hydrology. The swamp changed and the species went extinct at that spot. But we were able to save the species, and we've now got it in a number of ex situ collections awaiting restoration into swamps in the southwest region. But orchids are one of the groups of plants that are probably the greatest storytellers. And certainly in our backyard, and particularly in Vic Park, the little bits of fragment of bushland that you have, you will always find an orchid somewhere. Here are some of those orchids. And David Attenborough wrote the foreword to a book on orchid conservation I did 5 years ago. And I was he wrote this and he said, orchids surely are the most glamorous of plants, but the most threatened of plants. And they were his own words. And he was fascinated with orchids, but he always found them very difficult to handle. And in a series that we worked on called The Private Life of Plants back in the late 90s, he showed one of the interesting phenomenon that happens with orchids. And this is what it is.
They found that many orchids have their own special fungal partner. They devised methods of isolating that fungus and then culturing it with the orchid seed. Under the right conditions, the two strike up their partnership immediately. The fungus extracts nutriment from the culture medium in a way that the orchid can't do for itself and supplies it to the young plant.
So what David was showing there was this amazing ability of the dust-like orchid seed, which is the smallest seed. All orchids have the smallest seeds of all the flowering plants, even though they're very diverse, but they need that fungus. And in Western Australia, all of our orchids have their own individual fungus that they use. So to get orchids back into urban areas is a real indicator that you've had great success. So we're working on those aspects. And this is the way we do it. This is a very rare orchid, the grand spider orchid. It grows just south of Vic Park. It's become rare through clearing. This is nothing more than a little block of agar that you can see Uncle Toby's breakfast oats in agar jelly, and we sprinkle on the orchid seed and we get this extraordinary growth. It's meant that we've been able to save the species and grow it on and then put it back into safe locations. And each one of these orchid seed capsules can produce up to 5,000 seeds, all viable. And so we have a method for growing these orchids very effectively. It means that for many of our orchids, we have a really effective means, a little bit of technology, but Curtin University, we now have an orchid research lab. But I want to share with you, fungi are one thing, but orchids and their pollination syndromes are quite another thing. And this is an orchid that, again, you have in some of your bushland habitats. It's an orchid that's common in Kings Park bushland. And a few years back, I had a future PhD student visiting from Italy who was going to start a PhD. And she said, I'm on holidays. She didn't tell me that it was actually her honeymoon with her husband. While he stayed in the hotel, she worked in our little bit of bushland near our research labs, because we decided that we would work on what's pollinating the banded greenwood that you can see here. It's a lovely little species. It looks like a fungus. It's dingy. It flowers in winter when all the fungi are up. And people had seen fungus gnats visiting this orchid. And they assumed that this was what you call nest site deception. So that the female would go up and, looking around for a place to lay eggs in this fungus-looking flower, it would be tricked into pollinating the flower. So Daniela started work on this. That was one of the first specimens that she brought back, and you can see we could confirm that the fungus gnat had yellow pollen just on its thorax. So things were looking good, but then she announced there's a problem. All of the all of the gnats that she was able to get were all male. They weren't female. They weren't looking for a place to lay eggs. And indeed, what she was able to do was capture this remarkable footage of male fungus gnats for the first time being recorded visiting a greenwood orchid as the first fungus gnat pollinated orchid. And here it is in Kings Park bushland. See it probing that little lip, and you watch the magic of that lip in a moment. It's sensitive to touch, and you'll see gets flipped up into that hood. You can see it moving around inside the hood, and it brushes past the pollen and then exits out the back, out the front here through the special one-way channels. When we discovered this, we discovered the hormones that are involved, and indeed this was yet another case of a phenomenon that we'd found in many other orchids of sexual deception. And sexual deception of fungus gnats has been found elsewhere. So, for example, in South America, in amber, they've now discovered fungus gnats with orchids pollen on them. So 40 to 55 million years ago, probably in a separate, different orchid group, fungus gnats, males, have been getting deceived by orchids that just play a very clever arms race to get those pollination systems. Now, probably the best example of this are the hammer orchids. Once found throughout the Perth region, now very rare. We had 10 species. One has gone extinct. They're all only found in Western Australia. And here is the system of pollination. This orchid has virtually no leaf display, but it uses that special lip that you can see the male wasp of this thinid wasp grasping. And it produces, that lip produces a pheromone that matches the pheromone of the flightless female. And the orchid flower is about the same height as the flightless female. And the system is extraordinarily successful in attracting male wasps. So much so that male wasps will always go to the false female before they'll go to the female. But after about 6 to 8 visits, they learn and they won't visit the orchid again. And what we've now discovered is many of our orchids in the southwest, from beard orchids on the right to hair orchids, which are now in flower, all use sexual deception. And hair orchids use ants. There are hoverflies in elbow orchids that flower in December on the granite rocks above Perth. So sexual deception is an extraordinary way to diversify. This is the special hormone that's produced. It's a pyrazine produced from special glands that have been discovered. And the whole system means you can diversify by having specialized pollination systems. But the specialization doesn't stop there. We can see that with the hammer orchids, and this is an example of the intricate ecological web that sits around these old and stable plants and animals. So we can see the pollination illustrated up here in the top of the image. The seed has the requirement for a very special fungus that you can see just down here on the right. Sorry. And that fungus is in fact the root system for those young seedlings. So the orchid never develops a root system, it just uses the fungus, as you saw in David Attenborough's footage. That's a specialised fungus and a specialised pollinator. We've now pieced together the other side, which is the wasp life cycle. And the wasp life cycle comprises of the male picks up the female, she's flightless, she has to feed on particular native nectar to get the carbohydrates for her to burrow down the 15 to 20 centimetres to find a scarab beetle larvae. She then lays an egg on that larvae, crawls the way up again, and she'll do that 6 to 8 times before being exhausted. That wasp egg will then hatch, live on the larvae, pupate, and so the cycle's produced. The scarab beetles live on particular native shrubs only. So here we have both a nectar requirement, a scarab beetle, and a particular native shrub to complete the life cycle of the wasp. Now the orchid cheats the wasp, so the wasp would be perfectly fine without the orchid, but the orchid will rapidly go extinct if we don't look after the wasp. So keeping together these integrated bushland environments with a mix of good species is fundamental to protecting that web of life that's an integral part of the complex systems that we have. So to conclude with, there is a wake-up call for us. Darwin, in 1836, when he wrote in his journal From the Voyage of the Beagle, he got the species wrong. The emu and the kangaroo, in fact, have gone into hyperabundance because of the pasture and water systems that we've put in place. But what he was really referring to was the fact that he felt that the way the settlers were clearing and burning the country, that many of these animals could be exterminated. So, in fact, he was the first conservation commentator about what was potentially happening in this country. And he was so right in what he
grain
has.
as well as-
Sorry, I'll just go back and start that again. And when we look at Western Australia, this is from the 1960s. This is a promotion for conditional land clearing. That's the Stirling Range that you can see in the background. And this is a promotional video for people to come and develop what was considered useless sandplain.
Growing grain as well as wool roll east of Albany for over 200 miles. In this area, agricultural land is being developed faster than in any other part of the rural southwest. More than 1 million acres of new country is being turned into farms every year. Much of the land was useless sandplain, now made fertile by science and mechanization. 2 bulldozers working a heavy chain can flatten up to 1,000 acres a day.
If only we could restore 1,000 acres a day, let alone 1,000 acres a year, we could turn the conservation equation. So that, and that is within our generations, was promoted 1 million acres a year put to the plough. So we misread these landscapes. Equally in the Perth region, we didn't realise that Perth, the city itself, sits at the epicentre of a mini hotspot within the southwest hotspot. What we find on the Swan Coastal Plain and in the Perth region, this is the state tally for threatened species through to priority ecological and threatened ecological communities. The state tally is significant. 30% of our threatened ecological communities occur on the Swan Coastal Plain. The green that you see here is Banksia woodland. And I grew up as a child north of Perth in what was inexhaustible, extensive Banksia woodland as far as you could see. It was a wonderful species. We used to chop it up for firewood and the bush was there to be taken. What we didn't realise that within my short lifetime, we would take those big green areas and reduce them to that. So now Banksia woodlands are a listed threatened ecological community. Of course, the consequences of this are that the specialised feeding habits of Carnaby's cockatoo on Banksias by its shortened mandible has meant that we've also taken that, a magnificent bird, to the brink of extinction. Now, this was also foretold by people such as Charles Lane Poole. He was the first conservator of forest, and in 1918 he legislated to protect forest from what he considered devastation within a generation. Because there was wildcat forest logging, the forest trees were there to be taken. Essentially, Lane Poole wasn't listened to. We cleared vast areas. We cleared the wheat belt in a blink of evolutionary time. And that's England, so you've got some scale to understand what we did on the landscapes. This is near my front gate. South of the city, I have a large protected area of forest. We discovered this once magnificent blackbutt tree, potentially 600 years old, no doubt, full of cockatoo habitat. And as you can see, this was logged in the 1950s, and we don't have a tree of that size back in that forest anywhere. The importance of protecting these environments is that biodiversity gets lost. This is work done in Eastern Australia last year where they found the regent honeyeater, because we have depleted its population, that the young no longer know their song because it's not taught to them by their elders. We see this also in the 2000 species, plant species that no longer have a place to call home, much of this in the wheat belt and on the Swan Coastal Plain. Take this, the West Australian underground orchid, now down to just 3 plants in the central wheat belt, or in the southern part of the state and the Stirling Range, Banksia brownii, the most extraordinary and only soft-leaved of all of the Banksias, the featherleaf Banksia, populations kept alive with injections of fungicide as they desperately tried to put plants into new safe locations due to burning and introduction of dieback into those populations. Even in our Kings Park, we now know that maintaining our bush is a lot cheaper than trying to restore. This is the famous scarp restoration that was done at the end of the 1990s. It was 5 million in restoration cost and 1 million invested in restoration science, so $6 million, 1 million plants put in before, during and after, if only we'd looked after that 17 hectares. What we discovered is that we could then value a hectare of our land in Kings Park at that stage, if we'd looked after it, as a saving of $285,000 per hectare in restoration cost. That's cubic metres of various weeds that were taken out and 1,300 feral trees that are taken over that site. Equally, we can do our bit in our own backyard. The sound that you can hear here is not Carnaby's, but the other whitetail, and this is my property down at Waroona, just an hour south of Perth, where we have the largest population of Bowdowns cockatoo. And what we're doing is turning over our macadamia plantation to that bird to try and keep them alive. But equally, you can do your bit in your little bit of backyard to help that bird. For example, a single macadamia seed has the same nourishment as 20 banksia seeds. And we've now lost so much of our banksia forest, we can't look towards saving the species just by planting banksias alone, but doing your bit in your backyard. And if you need evidence of that, this is a video which now won't play. I do apologise for that, which shows Carnaby's cockatoo recently in macadamias in Perth. So macadamias, pecans and almonds, plant them in your yard and you'll make Carnaby's very happy indeed. But in the journey forward, the next generation is important. And I've been inspired by work that we've done with schools in the UK, which we'd love to do with schools in Western Australia. This is Witherington School, which has an amazing group of students. They have little tissue culture labs. They grow all sorts of rare tropical orchids, which they send back to various countries around the world. It's a program developed in conjunction with Kew. And wouldn't it be great if our schools also did this thing? And so these kids were going off to foreign countries to help them with their conservation. It's also important that every opportunity to bring back our biodiversity into our urban context is not missed. And I work with Main Roads to encourage them, put back real bush as far as you can in your major infrastructure, rather than what we see here on the right. So this is Melaleuca megacephala, which is a wonderful Melaleuca, grows in Geraldton. But this is just up at Erindale Road. And just nearby is a wonderful native Jarrah Banksia woodland that they should have used as a reference site. So seize every opportunity that you can. But to conclude with, our actions today and how we do things today will be the biodiversity of tomorrow. I started with that image of prescribed burning. There's emerging science and new papers being published showing that if we continue to do this on our landscapes, this will cause major impacts that will be irreversible. This is not a piece of wasted bushland or scrub. This is the Stirling Range National Park. This is the new enhanced prescribed burning process where you aerial burn large areas. That area south of Perth, 160 square kilometres, the area north of Perth, we're just getting those areas. But on this day alone, potentially 200 square kilometres was put to the torch in a way where very few wildlife may have survived. So it's important for us to take stock of what we have in our backyard, to work through our backyard, but also be involved with the way that we need to manage the future of our biodiversity. And this is a reminder that there are impacts of what we burn every day. This was one of 18 translocated western ringtail possums, despite the fauna relocators saying don't burn this reserve. 18 of those animals were burnt alive. This is a little female that had been put into the area who had been translocated from an urban development where she had no home. So we need to learn, we need to change our practices. And by doing that, we will share what Darwin said when he visited Eastern Australia, there is grandeur in this view of life. And I leave you with one of our wonderful Queen of Sheba orchids, once common throughout Perth, now very rare, but we're now growing many hundreds of them in our program up at Curtin, and hopefully we can have those on display in the next few years. Thank you all. Whoops, sorry.
Thank you so much, Kingsley, for sharing all of that with us. Quite an amazing story that you walked us through. It really puts things in perspective. So thank you very much for all of that. Does anyone have any questions for Kingsley? Councillor Devereux.
Peter, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Oh, thanks so much, Kingsley. That was just a wonderful lead through. Yeah, really loved it. Absolutely fascinating. And I'm always amazed at the number of people, family and friends who have no idea that we're part of a biodiversity hotspot in the southwest of WA. Just staggering, and an indictment on our education system and many things. But
Peter, spot on. And we have to work on the education system. Yeah, definitely.
But nevertheless, yeah, just the way you captured all of that was just wonderful. So thanks so much for that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and of course, I love your work on the sandpit as well. That's a very exciting thing happening in the town of Vic Park. I guess part of my concern, though, as well, is having sort of islands of biodiversity in a sea of streets and everything where we don't have that, and just wondering what you think we can do in Vic Park particularly to better connect and create corridors for biodiversity, because I think that's, you know, we've got bits of remnant bush, but and also collaboration across councils is key. But yeah, just wanted to see what you think we might be able to do in terms of building corridors between the bits of gems that we have to try and make them more viable. Thanks so much.
Yeah, that is the biggest challenge in the 170 linear kilometres north to south that Perth stretches over. We are just a sea of roofs. I hear Carnaby's, and I think, what do you see? You just see concrete, you see asphalt, you see roofs. You 250 years ago, you saw nothing but wonderful banks of woodland. And, you know, for the first time last year, Carnaby's didn't leave the Swan Coastal Plain. It's the first. So their whole evolutionary trajectory has now been altered by us. We don't know what that means for the long-term future of the species, but it's not good. So that's why I'm very passionate about people in their backyards doing stuff, which is not going to be with native plants, but just help them across this period in whatever way we can. In terms of what you can do beyond that, for birds like the honey eaters, it's good news. We know they will move. We know if we put things in median strips, noting all the safety issues, that's really, really critical. We look at verges, we look at people's gardens, and we encourage the right species. And you've got to have species that people are going to enjoy. Let's face it, unless they see it and they say, we really love it. And everyone goes to Kings Park bushland, and I get 1,000 requests every year when the kangaroo paws. Oh, I want red and green kangaroo paws like Kings Park. I said, well, plant them. And then, of course, they walk on. And I think you could have some template garden areas that really showcase, essentially, I like to say to people, I helped develop some of those display gardens, which are up near Aspects on the War Memorial Concourse in Kings Park, and they were really teasers. They would get people saying, wow, oh, ow. So I think you could have little teasers. You've got really busy spots. You've got Albany Highway, you've got Shepparton Road, you've got little spots. Let's do some interesting teasers and get people driving past saying, hey, did you see that thing in flower? What was that? And we pump prime nurseries, so they're all ready to meet the demand. So I think they're aspects. So the birds will be easy. The reptiles and the things that crawl, it's not good. And there may be opportunities to put back some of that sedentary fauna, but you do it with great caution because, of course, they're landlocked. and they're used to moving across those landscapes. But I think, Peter, at this stage, it's first steps. I think the sandpit is an inspiring project and the first of its type in a local government area to actually set a target that I think is really going to shift the dial, and that's going to put Vic Park on the map and really say to other people, actually, that's not restoration what you're doing, that's just a little bit of amateur gardening. This is what restoration looks like, and this is the biodiversity benefits, and look what happens. And then we find our First Nation people come along with us because they say, yeah, that's the bush. That's the bush. Now, it might not be every species, but bushland without a stylidium, a trigger plant, is not bushland. But nobody puts it back in restoration, including Kings Park, because they say, oh, it's too difficult because of the weed control. But we're working with the team at Vic Park with all of our science to try and get all of those things to happen. So I think it's a work in progress, and it's baby steps now, but giant steps hopefully soon.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Anyone else? Any questions or comments that you'd like to make? No. Well, look, that is fine. That is fine, everyone. Again, would just really like to thank you, Kingsley, for your time and sharing such valuable knowledge with us. Thank you, everyone, for again participating in this session tonight. We have been recording this session. So we will try and make that available to everyone. And again, thank you very much for your time. And if no one has any other questions or comments, I think we'll draw it to a close there.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks again, Kingsley.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks again.